Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest, an old friend on the internet, somebody I've been chatting with, somebody who sends me excellent information. His name is Ken Ammi. He's the proprietor of the website True Free Thinker, and he also has a new YouTube channel with a wide variety of videos that are important to the modern Christian and are really important to anybody. Great information. So, Ken, are you there?
Yes, William.
Great. Thanks for being on the show. I really appreciate it. Ken has just published a recent book, one of his many different works. This one is titled The Apocryphal Jesus. It's a comprehensive analysis of apocryphal texts. You know, he covers about 40 texts and analyzes them and kind of goes through and details what he thinks is relevant or important in the modern Christian. And so, Ken, if you can provide just a little intro, talk about yourself, and talk about why you wrote this book, and talk a little bit about the research you did, please.
Well, William, it's a pleasure to be speaking to you in person. I appreciate you having me on, and I appreciate you making me available to your audience.
Awesome. Well, thank you. I think this is an important information, so I'm really glad that you are willing to discuss it with me.
Well, thank you. And in fact, I thought we would start with modern times, set the table as to what this issue is in the first place, and then backtrack, a few millennia.
Excellent. Good. That's great.
So I find that in modern times, generally the issue is the historical Jesus, and I have to deal with it a lot when my discussions with atheists, more than anybody else. Generally, they will start by claiming that Jesus never existed. Okay, now at this point, I don't handle it as a historical issue. I will first handle this as a logical issue, because the claim Jesus never existed is a claim to possessing knowledge. Right? It's a positive affirmation of
right.
Jesus' non-existence. So then I can ask, well, what proof do you have that he never existed? Generally, the reply will be like, well, you are the one who believes in Jesus, so it's incumbent upon you to prove it. However, it's not that I'm asking them to prove a negative, prove that Jesus didn't exist. I'm asking them for why they claim to know that, right? That's why it's a logical issue, because the positive affirmation is that they're claiming to know that as a fact. So then they can be called upon to provide evidence or proof.
Okay.
And so at this point, I find they generally back down instantly and go to the fallback position, which is, well, okay, yeah, maybe some guy named Jesus really did exist, but he wasn't the Son of God. He wasn't God. He didn't perform miracles and all of these things. And that's the point where you get into the issue of the historical Jesus.
Okay. So then when somebody, asks you about this historical Jesus, these apocryphal texts verify the historical record. Would you agree with that? That Jesus
I would.
existed? Okay.
Right. And now we'll talk about genre in a second.
Okay.
I wanted to give you an example of this modern day way that these issues are being dealt with. For example, a gentleman named Michael Palkovich wrote a book called No Meek Messiah, but a Fable of the Christ. And he claims that he consulted 126 authors from around the time of Jesus and found none of them referred to Jesus. Well, when I saw that, I thought that was interesting, because quite a few years ago, I provided a list on my site of 210 references to Jesus within the first 2 centuries. Now, what's funny about Michael's book is that the sources he's appealing to, some are like botanists, some are physicians. In other words, some of these authors are people who would have no reason whatsoever to mention Jesus within the context of their books.
Right, makes sense.
So that's kind of the way that these issues are being handled by pop researchers. You know, it's just very unreliable. Fantastic claims. They get a lot of, they kind of go viral. They get a lot of coverage, and a lot of people repeat it. But when you actually look at the evidence, it's really problematic.
Have you heard of Joe Atwill's book, Caesar's Messiah? This one that came out that argues that Christ was an invention of the Roman emperors. I think that might be considered something in the same vein. It's like a denial of actual existence, but that it was a fictional, Christ's life was a fictional creation.
That's right. So that's one of the many ways to look at these issues. Is there's the historical Jesus issue, which is that attempting to understand who this man was without necessarily relying on the New Testament because it's considered to be too theologically biased.
Okay.
Now, of course, if Jesus is who the New Testament says he is, then of course that would be a historical record of his life. Then you have roughly defined genres such as Jesus mythicism, which is the kind of claim that Jesus either never even existed, or else he was just a man, and then his followers just took bits and pieces of different pagan mythology and applied them to Jesus. That's very popularly known as the Zeitgeist view, because there was a styled documentary called Zeitgeist, part of which really promulgated that view.
Right.
And this is also known as the Christ myth theory, or pagan copycat Jesus.
Right. So
various terms.
The copying of these other mythical gods from other cultures. Is that? Would you agree with that?
That is the claim. And my reply is always the same. Show me primary source documentation. Not what somebody said, somebody read in somebody's book that made the claim, but the actual ancient documentation, and that is always lacking. And so you have a lot of wordplay. You'll have somebody referred to as having had a virgin birth when she wasn't a virgin. You will have somebody claim to have performed miracles maybe when they weren't, or in other words, it's employing a lot of the same terminology, but when you actually look at the mythology, the way those terms are used is misleading.
Okay, gotcha.
Now also you have the issue of, I'll give you an example. Richard Carrier is an atheist historian. Okay, so he points out, and I was very glad for his honesty in doing so, that there is a book published in 1875 AD by Percy Graves, and it's called The World's 16 Crucified Saviors. Now, this is the late 1800s, so it has one of those wonderfully old-timey subtitles.
Mm-hmm.
Let me read the whole title to you. Listen to this. Right. The World's 16 Crucified Saviors, or Christianity Before Christ, containing new, startling, and extraordinary revelations in religious history, which disclose the Oriental origins of all the doctrines, principles, precepts, and miracles of the Christian New Testament, and furnishing a key for unlocking many of its sacred mysteries, besides comprising a history of the 16 heathen crucified gods.
That's like the entire first chapter, right?
Yeah. So, William, next time you publish a book, I want to see one of these subtitles that takes up like half a page.
Okay, I'll do it. I'll also reignite or resurrect that tradition of super long secondary titles, subtitles.
So my point was that even an atheist historian says this book is just bad. It's just bad scholarship and nobody should rely on it. Fine. While you will not find anybody worth their sea salt quoting that book today, the problem is that they will still paraphrase it, knowingly or not, consciously or not. In other words, the contents and claims of that book are still alive and well today, even though nobody would actually quote this book because it's been so thoroughly discredited. You see what I mean?
Yes,
the idea survives.
The ideas are still around.
Right.
They still need to be addressed.
Exactly. And the ideas are just repeated over and over again. Then they're refuted. Then they're repeated. Then they're refuted. It's really never ending. It's just sort of like different ways of saying the same thing.
Right.
And that's why a book like this that's been discredited, the book itself is discredited, but its contents have a life of their own.
Right, but would you agree, or would you think that many of the mythologizing of the record of Christ began very early in our historical record? That the mythologizing may even have started in the 1st, 2nd, or 3rd century?
I would say that the earliest sources, and perhaps the more reliable ones, even if it's in a backhanded manner, they affirm what the New Testament says about Jesus. For example, the Babylonian Talmud referring to him as a sorcerer. Now, does that tell me he was a sorcerer? Not necessarily, but it tells me that his miracles are undeniable. So what's being called into question is not the things that he did, but the source of the power by which he did it.
Interesting.
So somebody might say, well, an ancient text refers to Jesus having raised from the dead, just like Osiris or whatever. But, okay, it is being affirmed that he raised from the dead, right? The other thing is another issue. They are forced to admit certain facts about him, even while turning and twisting and doing all of that along the way.
Gotcha.
Now, let me make one point about the modern day way that this is handled by quoting, again, Richard Carrier. And this time he's referring to Raphael Lataster, who's another atheist writing on historical Jesus issues. And so Richard Carrier knows that Lataster has written a work on, quote, the characteristics of Jesus by focusing only on what atheists and agnostic experts are saying, and not Christian believers.
Interesting.
Regarding the latter to be too biased to consider, since any good argument they have should be as convincing to experts who aren't believers anyway. So really, we should only be looking at the debate among atheists. Apparently, atheists are not too biased.
Right.
But that's another issue. That's another issue. Yeah. And then about this take on the issue, Carrier notes that it's a good point. And moreover, quote, Lataster clarifies that we are talking not about the Christ of faith, but whether we can reconstruct a plausible, mundane historical Jesus. In other words, that the only theses being debated here are those of secular non-believers and the expert sphere. He explains in detail why this is, in fact, only a debate among atheists, and why we should just ignore Christian apologists altogether. He outlines how he will analyze it as a neutral party. So now, again, apparently an atheist is neutral. But that's another issue.
Right. Well, we could have a whole another hour discussion about biases among atheists, right? Or biases among Christians, I guess.
Well, of course there are. Look, he said that any good argument should be as convincing to experts who aren't believers anyway, and I think that's a good point. But then to pretend that they themselves are unbiased is, well, obviously inaccurate. So my point is just to set the table and explain how these issues are being handled in these days.
Okay, great. So that lays the foundation of this book. So let's go to the Apocryphal Jesus, and you kind of covered some of the intro, the information about the zeitgeist ideals or ideas, the Jesus mythicists that are still around.
Right.
But you put the apocryphal texts that we're going to cover into two main categories. What you call the sayings and the gap fillers. Can you please explain that?
Yes, so let me just make a point about how now we're heading back in history. Now we're looking at the ancient texts. So my book is not about atheism or the atheists that are dealing with historical Jesus issues. So now we're heading back in time. Okay. So I called it the Apocryphal Jesus just as a generic title more than anything. Apocryphal is just letting us know that we're not sure who wrote the text. That's really the bottom line of what it means. So you could even say there's books in the Bible that are apocryphal if we're using that particular definition of the term, just meaning we don't know who wrote them. Now, the term apocryphal is then technically used for any book outside of the biblical canon that claims to cover issues that the Bible also covers. So you see, it's not so much about the terminology, but about the terminology's definition. So what I did is just provided a sample of various apocryphal texts, like you said, going from sayings genre to Acts genre to Gnostic genre. Now, the sayings genre is basically like our modern day version of a book of quotations. That's all it is.
Right.
And so that would be relatively easy to write because you don't have to worry about getting historical facts correct. All you have to do is sit there, write a bunch of one-liners, right, and that's your sayings text, right? It'd be like sending out tweets.
Right. So the early 2,000 year ago tweets.
Yeah.
Well, it would be a lot easier to do because if you read the New Testament, most of Christ's messages are stated within real world context, whether it's the Last Supper or the Sermon on the Mount. He's somewhere, in the temple. So there's always this kind of backdrop of where Christ is speaking a message, and typically that message is tailored for that audience or area too.
Right. Now the Acts genre is one I did not include too many of in my book because by definition, it's just like the book of Acts. It's Jesus died, resurrected, ascended, and then here's what happened after that. So since my context was what these texts have to say about Jesus, there wasn't much in the Acts genre that I could include. I did include a few of them that reference Jesus here and there. Now you asked about the gap fillers, and that's my term for it.
Okay.
Say for instance, you and I are sitting around saying, hey, the Bible mentions Simon of Cyrene who helped Jesus carry his cross, and then he's gone. I mean, you learn nothing more about him whatsoever. I know. Let's write a book about Simon and what happened in his life after that, right? It's a gap filler. It's just filling a gap in something the Bible states.
Right. So the other synoptic gospels or the four gospels?
Well, basically anywhere in the text where you see some kind of vague or generic reference or a more like a passing reference to something, somebody could later say, hey, I'm going to write something to fill in that gap and explain what might have been, or maybe they actually did some research back in the day and found out what actually happened.
Gotcha.
For example, you have apocryphal texts that give us the names of the thieves that were crucified with Jesus. You have other ones that give us the name of the woman who asked for the head of John the Baptist. You have all kinds of bits and pieces of information. And frankly, I mean, it's really hard to tell which are accurate or not. But they are gap fillers, whether true or not, because that's the point. They're trying to say, hey, here's something the Bible doesn't tell us very much about. Now, here's a whole apocryphal text that provides that information for you.
The authors take the name of some of these texts to give them the kind of patina of authority. Is that correct?
Right. So if you and I, going back to my example, let's say that we sat around and wrote a story about Simon of Cyrene, we could just say, and by the way, I who am writing this is Luke who traveled with Paul, because then that would give my text authority. right?
Right.
I place upon it a pseudonym, the name of a known person that has some authority, and then that lends authority to whatever I might happen to write.
When you talk about these texts, you kind of went through and referenced them coming from certain areas. You know, there were a variety.
Right.
You have a long list of texts. You want to cover where their geographic provenance, where they were found?
Yes. Well, as I mentioned in the intro, it is very difficult to find very much detail about these texts as texts, right? As documents. Where were they found? When were they found? When were they written? How many manuscripts do we have? How do they compare? It's very difficult because really no one's very much concerned about that stuff.
Gotcha.
They only care if it's the Bible, right?
Okay.
The Bible, well, we better have handwritten texts that have been vacuum sealed for 2,000 years, or we won't believe it, and we better have tons of manuscripts. But when it comes to apocryphal texts, hey, one single fragmented manuscript from 500 years after Jesus, that'll do. That's plenty for us. That's authoritative. And then they'll pretend that's some sort of a challenge to the Bible.
Interesting.
So, of course, these were found all over the place, but there were a few main caches of manuscript finds. And one was Oxyrhynchus in Egypt.
Okay.
And then another one was Nag Hammadi. And so the Nag Hammadi texts are mostly Gnostic texts.
Okay. And can you define Gnostic? What's your definition of Gnostic? Just not in concordance with the standard canon?
Well, there were a lot of different Gnostic sects. So that could be very complex, but in short, I will just say that the concept of Gnosticism, the very word itself means knowledge, right? Gnosis, Gnostic.
Right.
And so the bottom line claim is special secret knowledge that was only revealed to these certain people who then started all these Gnostic groups, and they are styled mystery religions is the way they pretty much function, where you can only get these secret teachings from them. One major concept in Gnosticism is that there is one of many gods who is so arrogant that he claims to be the only God. Now, in Gnosticism, spirit is absolutely pure and the material is absolutely corrupt. So now this God creates the material realm, and that's a big no-no because basically he created corruption. And then he tells his creation, hey, I'm the one and only God. Well, who does that sound like? Okay, so basically Gnosticism takes everything that's in the Bible and turns it inside out, upside down, and backwards. So now you have this arrogant and actually senile, delusional God keeping his creation nice and dome-like, in a garden, and he commands them to not partake of the knowledge of the tree of good and evil, the knowledge of good and evil.
Gotcha.
Along comes Satan, who in Gnosticism is the savior, right? Because he comes along and he encourages God's creation to rebel against him with the positive payback of gaining knowledge, right? Gnosis.
Right.
And so he's literally the enlightener of humanity. So you see how the whole story is turned upside down.
Right. Makes sense.
No, I was just going to give an example that I'm sure will make a lot of sense to you. If you think about the story of Prometheus in Greek mythology, that's a good example of this concept because Prometheus stole fire from Zeus and gave it to humanity against Zeus's will. right? And he was condemned for it.
Right. The
But
bird ate
human
his liver
beings-
every day, right?
I'm sorry.
Then the bird, it wasn't the part of the torture, a bird came and ate his liver every day while he was chained to rocks or something?
Yes, that was his punishment. And in fact, that, you know what's interesting is where supposedly he was chained up, and that happened to him, was in Sochi, in Russia, where the Olympics took place a few years ago.
Interesting. I didn't know it was Sochi.
Yeah. So yeah, supposedly a bird ate out his liver right out of his body every day, and it grew back every day and ate it every day.
Right.
But see, so the point is, well, humanity would be quite pleased to receive fire because it's such a useful technology. But the fact is, it was against Zeus's will. So Prometheus is seen as heroic from our point of view because of what he gave us.
Right.
And so you see how the fire there is symbolic of enlightenment.
Right.
That's really the point is, here comes Satan to enlighten us, to give us knowledge or technology such as fire against God's will.
God's will, right. And so, yeah, it's that idea, the Gnostic idea. I mean, I think that's a great transition right into the first apocryphal text that you cover, which is the Gospel of Thomas, because you relate a lot of the statements in the Gospel of Thomas, which is the earliest manuscript you reference as, or one of the early ones, as kind of Gnostic. And that's actually probably one of the most quoted, if not the most quoted, apocryphal text, right?
Yes.
Okay, can you talk a little bit about that, the Gospel of Thomas?
Well, just to explain to the audience what I did is, for each apocryphal text, I give very, very basic information. I explain the places in those texts that agree with the New Testament, and then what I call unique features, which is things that are not in the New Testament. And these range from being simply or non-biblical to being actually anti-biblical. So something can be non-biblical. That doesn't necessarily mean it contradicts it. It's just something extra. Gotcha. But then you can get to the extreme range where, okay, this is actually anti-biblical. This is actually contradicting.
Gotcha.
So yeah, the Gospel of Thomas is one of the Nag Hammadi Gnostic texts. And it tells you right there, these are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke to Didymus Judas Thomas. So there you go. It's all this guy has to do is sit around one day and say, oh yeah, you know, I got these secret teachings that no one else did, and here's my book about it.
Right.
I found that a lot of it is, if you notice, I refer to it's Buddhist koan style phrases. Okay, now Buddhist koan are those famous statements that are not necessarily meant to be a logical statement, but are supposed to get you to liberate your mind and just sort of receive enlightenment. Like, what is the sound of one hand clapping? You know, that's the kind of
paradoxical statements.
Yeah, and you know what the sound of one hand clapping is? The sound of my hand slapping your face.
Right.
But
right.
So the Gospel of Thomas is filled with these, one-liners that I guess they're either nonsense or I'm just not spiritually attuned enough to understand them. Because if you read them, it's like, okay, whatever that means,
Right.
It's just kind of gobbledygook, spiritual gobbledygook, really.
Yeah, and you reference the kind of Gnostic quality of the koan statements. You actually reference G.K. or compare the statements to G.K. Chesterton.
Yes, because, in reading G.K. Chesterton, I often noticed something, and then I read somebody describing it, and I thought, yes, that's what it is. And that is, quote, whenever possible, Chesterton made his points with popular sayings, proverbs, allegories, first carefully turning them inside out. And what my point was that the likes of Gnostic one-liners are not as sophisticated as that with which Chesterton came up. They're just really, really just gobbledygook. I mean, If you studied Gnosticism long enough, you could probably unravel what some of them were supposed to mean. But I think part of it is just to get you to understand that you're just not with it, basically. You're not enlightened enough to understand this stuff.
Right. I mean, yeah, you quote
So,
from,
of course,
verse 2 is like a perfect example. Let him who seeks continue seeking till he finds. When he finds, he will become troubled. When he becomes troubled, he will be astonished, and he will rule over all. Like, whatever that means.
yeah, exactly.
I mean, and one of the interesting aspects, I remember reading the Gospel of Thomas 20 years ago, but they talk, there's like something about the feminine quality, if I remember. Yeah.
Sure.
And you want to talk about that?
Right. Yeah, right here, quote, Simon Peter said to him, Jesus, said to him, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. Jesus says, I myself shall lead her in order to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. For every woman who will make herself male will enter the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
So there you go, ladies. That's all you have to do.
Yeah. I mean, that pretty much is such a contradictory statement, or something so outside the standard gospels that in itself could negate the, not in addition to all the other stuff, but also negates the validity of the so-called Gospel of Thomas.
Yes, and see, I thank you for saying that, and that's an extremely important point, that you don't have to be a scholar to read one text from another and realize, okay, these are of a very different nature. And in fact, I'm going to read a quote from C.S. Lewis now.
Okay.
C.S. Lewis is widely known as the Christian apologist who's an ex-atheist, which is true. But remember, he was also a professor of medieval and Renaissance literature at Cambridge University.
Right.
And here's what he wrote. Now, as a literary historian, I am perfectly convinced that whatever else the Gospels are, they are not legends. I have read a great deal of legend, and I'm quite clear that they are not the same sort of things. Right? So here's a man who's professionally trained to discern the meaning of text to the point where he's a professor and he's teaching others to do it, and he's letting you know his opinion as a historian. These are just not the same genre. They're not the same style, and they don't contain the same content.
Yeah.
Even though part of the premise in my book is we can still go into these texts and derive some truth about Jesus from them.
Gotcha. You can always remember C.S. Lewis's death. He died the same day that John F. Kennedy and Aldous Huxley, November 22nd, 1963. They all died on the same day. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. Strange little thing. You can actually kind of correlate them all together, because it was all having something to, they were, I don't know. We can get into like kind of subtle things, but they were all pretty intense thinkers, in their own way. I guess John F. Kennedy was too independent for his own good. But C.S. Lewis changed his mind. Aldous Huxley was really there with Leary, kind of talking about drugs.
Right.
And when he was dying, he was dosed with LSD the same day, November 22nd, 1963.
Well, yeah, they were definitely each extremely influential within their spheres,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's Kennedy's independence, ended it. So, yeah, so that was the Gospel of Thomas, and then there was another one about the Orintius Gospel.
Yes.
12:24, you reference it. And you call it lacuna. Can you define lacuna?
Oh, well, lacuna is just a
omissions, right?
Yes, it's just a technical term for a hole in the manuscript. That's all it really means. Okay. So
yes.
maybe that's why a lot of times when you read some of these texts, you'll see in the middle of a sentence there'll be a bracket, and then what the scholar who was translating it thought the word that belonged there was, because there's literally a hole punched through the manuscripts.
Gotcha.
For whatever reasons, who knows? I mean, mice might have eaten it, or somebody poked it, or it's just old. It's just old. So a lot of these, so a lot of these are fragmentary. You could be missing one word, you could be missing several pages, but lacuna, that's all it really means. It's a hole in the manuscript.
The next text we're going to talk about is the Gospel of Peter. Can you talk a little bit about the Gospel of Peter?
Sure. Why don't we look at, this one is dated to between 70 and 160 AD.
Okay.
And so, again, I begin each section with the little bit that I could find about it as a text, as a manuscript, and sometimes, as in this case, what maybe a scholar had to say about the nature of the manuscript or what shape it was in.
Okay.
And so this one, for instance, mentions Herod, Pilate, Joseph of Arimathea, and affirms Jesus' existence and his crucifixion or resurrection. So again, you can see how even these apocryphal texts admit a lot about who Jesus was. And let me make a general statement that I've been meaning to make. I can't tell you who wrote these, and more specifically, why they wrote them. Right? Were they seeking to deceive? Maybe some were, and maybe some weren't. Were they seeking to portray Jesus very different from the one of history in the New Testament on purpose? Maybe some were, maybe some weren't. In other words, I have no idea. Mm-hmm. Maybe some of the Gnostic texts are more obvious because they specifically deny certain things about the historical and New Testament Jesus. But maybe somebody was sitting around and saying, Jesus is a very important character, or maybe they were even Christians, and maybe they thought, hey, I would like to have somebody know these certain basic facts about the history of Jesus that the New Testament doesn't cover, so I'm going to write them down. In other words, just because somebody wrote a text that we would generally categorize as apocryphal doesn't mean it's something bad. May not necessarily mean it's something good either. We just don't really know who wrote them or why in most cases. And that's just a general observation of all of these. Okay. That they state what they state. Maybe someone was being disingenuous, maybe they weren't.
Gotcha, interesting. And please continue.
Yeah, I noticed you had written a quote from this one that seemed to interest you. Why don't you go ahead and read that from your notes?
Yeah, the quote is, "The Jews and the elders and the priests, perceiving what evil they had done to themselves, began to lament and to say, 'Woe for our sins, that judgment hath drawn nigh, and the end of Jerusalem.'" I found that to be interesting. It was remarkably different than anything that's in the four Gospels. So I found that this was a different context, or different aspect of this kind of priestly class that was in Jerusalem, and
right.
The interesting thing is they seem to acknowledge that Jerusalem was going to end, and Christ said Jerusalem was going to end. I mean, predicted
That's
that
right.
The temple would be thrown down.
Yeah, and you'll notice I referred to that as a unique feature of that text for that very reason.
Yeah, it's interesting.
And so it portrays those who wanted Jesus crucified as being repentant. And, I'm sure some of them were, but it is an extra biblical statement. That's why I call it unique.
Yeah, that's definitely true.
And then, you noted that
it had a docetic character.
Docetic character, that's right. Yeah. So Docetism is the branch of Gnosticism that claims that Jesus only seemed to be human, right? Only seemed to be physical, only seemed to be material, but that human form was just an illusion.
Right.
So really, Jesus is being viewed as such a exemplary character that he must have been pure spirit. He could not have been physical because that would denote corruption. So that's an aspect of certain Gnostic beliefs.
Yeah, it's interesting. But
the gospel.
I think that the Gospels themselves, if you look at them, Christ is very human. clearly eating
Very,
and
very
suffering,
human.
and bleeding and experiencing sorrow, sadness,
In,
weeping.
in fact, one of the issues. Remember, I mentioned at the intro, Rafael Lataster, and actually, it's funny. I mean, I call him Rafael because Spanish is my first language, but he's Australian, so I doubt he would say Rafael,
Yeah.
but that's just me.
Well, I'm from Northern California.
Anyhow,
I'm from Northern California. We have a city that the Spanish named San Rafael, but everybody up there just says San Rafael. It doesn't sound
okay.
it doesn't sound as nice in English.
That's fine. Oh no, I thought you were going to say Raphael.
Well, so yes, people bungle it, garble it anyway, but it's just San Rafael. San Rafael. It might as well be spelled Rafel.
Yeah.
San Rafael.
So yeah, my point in bringing Lataster back is that he is one of the modern day researchers who's pushing the idea of a quote unquote celestial Jesus.
Interesting.
And that ties right into what you were just saying about how in the New Testament, Jesus is extremely obviously physical, not only pre-resurrection, but definitely post-resurrection. The celestial Jesus view is that everything the New Testament says about Jesus actually did not take place here on the physical earth, but in some sort of celestial realm. And basically it was tantamount to visions.
Wow, I haven't heard that one. That's a unique. I don't think that comports in any way with the record, though. I mean,
not whatsoever. Yeah. In fact, I personally interacted with Lataster on a Facebook page, and I was asking him questions about how he upholds his view, and giving him quotations and citations from the New Testament about how obviously we're told that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, he lived in Nazareth, he was born of a woman. I mean, all of these things that specify the location of his activities on the planet Earth.
Right.
And
I mean,
now,
you
what's
could even
interesting is I was just going to give you an inside baseball thing here. So him and I were having a discussion on Facebook day after day back. All of a sudden, I go to that page, and guess what? All the comments have been deleted, and the page was locked.
Wow.
For comments.
So at a certain point, he blocked you, huh?
Somebody didn't. I don't know who did it, but all the comments were gone, and the page was locked down. However, D. William, I've learned that whenever I'm having an extended discussion with somebody online, every single day I go in there to respond, I copy what they said, I copy what I said, and I paste it in a Word document, and I save it.
Interesting.
So guess what? I have that whole conversation, and I posted it on my website, even though it disappeared from Facebook.
Gotcha. So that's www.truefreethinker.com. Is that right? Good. So the listeners should go to truefreethinker.com and check that out. It'll probably be very interesting. I'd like to look at it.
And so the reason for mentioning Lataster and the celestial Jesus concept gets back to the discussion of the Gnostic texts, which denial, and yet the New Testament is extremely clear on that, as you noted.
Interesting, yeah. Let's go. That was a good coverage of the Gospel of Peter. The other one that I marked out was the letter of Clement of Alexandria on secret mark.
Right.
Or that's also, you called it was sometimes called secret mark.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah, if you notice, a lot of these have AKAs and AKAs, two AKAs.
Right.
A lot of these I have to provide many of the ways that they're known.
Interesting.
So
that's the one that comes right after the Gospel of Peter. And I mean, they use some big words in this. What is he saying? That do they use the word hierophant in the text?
Well, in the translation, anyhow.
Gotcha. So they translate it to hierophant. That's a very non-Christian term.
Right.
That's actually they use that term in the occult in the tarot cards.
Yep.
The hierophant.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
Well,
it's
see,
like,
again, I'm a big believer in that it's not the word that counts, it's the definition of the word that counts,
gotcha.
right? So it depends on the context in which it's used. In this case, I'm trying to find exactly, okay, yeah, and then mystagogue is another word that I really enjoyed in this text.
Right. That's an interesting one.
Did you catch?
Yeah, he brought in certain sayings of which
Yeah,
he knew the interpretation would, as a mystagogue, lead the hearers into the innermost sanctuary of that truth hidden by 7 veils, which kind of references the temple. If I remember, it's 7 veils into the Holy of Holies. Is that right?
right. So mystagogue,
Still there?
uh,
Just kind of missed you.
well, see, the title, the, the title referring to secret mark lets us know it's another one of these cases where Clement is saying the things they kept saying about the divinely inspired gospel according to Mark. Some are altogether falsifications, and others, even if they do contain some true elements, nevertheless are not reported truly. Right. So he's pointing out the fact that these are just what I call gap fillers,
Right.
and that some are absolutely, some are true but not reported accurately. You had 2 more you
Yeah, let's talk
listed in
about
your notes. We might as well knock those out.
Yeah, let's do it. Let's cover the Gospel of the Egyptians. That was from as early as 80 A.D. to 150 A.D. And, you know, it's like, I think it's known from quotations exclusively from Clement of Alexandria. Talks about this Gnostic sect called the Encratites, is that right? Which forbade marriage and abstinence from meat. And then 1 Timothy 4 lists among the doctrines of demons. I found that interesting.
Right, and so that was the important point in considering this, the Gospel of the Egyptians, is that if you read 1 Timothy 4, you'll notice he refers to certain things, such as forbidding to marry and abstinence from meat, as a doctrine of demons, which shows you that some of the New Testament was already having to deal with these Gnostic sects that were starting to promulgate their own views based on alleged secrets. So it's interesting that even within the New Testament itself, you have prepackaged replies to Gnostic teachings.
Right.
Like you may recall that when John talks about who is an antichrist, it's whoever denies Jesus came in the flesh. Now, that's interesting because he's not even talking at that point about, well, whoever denies Jesus is God, whoever denies Jesus is the Savior, whoever denies he's the Messiah. He's not even talking about that at that point. Just the fact that whoever denies he came in the flesh. So now that we have a little Gnosticism under our belts, we understand what he's saying. Right. He's directly pointing out the fact that if you deny that Jesus was a 3-dimensional physical material being, you're violating the gospel right then and there, because Jesus became flesh to die for us, right?
Right. Interesting.
So you see, with a little bit of this, with a little gnosis of Gnosticism, it's easier to understand what's going on when they're saying things like that.
Makes sense.
So I'm glad I'm glad that you pinpointed that quotation, because it allowed us to consider what the New Testament was already saying about these Gnostic groups and their beliefs.
I think these Gnostic groups are continuing on an ancient pre-Christ tradition of like secret groups and secret knowledge, these secret societies. So it seems like that was what creeped into early Christianity, is this desire to perpetuate this gospel as, this distinction between initiate or non-initiate, which is not in the original gospels as taught by Christ. It seems like that is something that creeped in right away. The gospel is for all.
Right. I would say that if one wanted to play relatively fast and loose with the facts, they could invent something such as that, well, hey, wait a minute now. There are times where Jesus told 3 of his apostles alone to come with him, and he would only reveal certain things to them. So obviously, he's a Gnostic teacher of secrets. And,
right.
and Jesus did talk about how he was speaking to people with ears to hear, and some of them just wouldn't get it. It's easy if you want to manipulate the New Testament into portraying this sort of Gnostic Jesus character. And then somebody could come along with a gap-filling text and say, oh, well, I have got a secret revelation, or I knew John, and he said that those times that he, when Jesus called him aside, he told him these secret things right here. You see, it's easy to play those games, and it's easy to make those claims. But again, as we've been noting, when these allegedly secret teachings plainly contradict everything else that we know about Jesus, then you know you're not dealing with the genuine article.
Yeah, good point. Excellent point. So the next one that I covered, or I found was interesting, was the Gospel of Thaddeus, and I just found it. I found it pretty interesting. That was timed or dated between 100 and 150 A.D., and that was a document found near Alexandria. These are all like Egyptian referenced apocryphal texts. But can you talk a little bit about the Gospel of Thaddeus?
Well, I noticed that you picked up on the claim that it was known who Jesus' earthly father actually was, so that it wasn't, Joseph wasn't his stepfather. Well, no, let me back up. Joseph was his stepfather, but God was not his father, that he was really birthed from some soldier named Pantera.
Right.
So
I was interested in that. You know, I know that Crowley himself, when he wrote the World's Tragedy referencing Christ's birth, he promoted that myth kind of in a very sarcastic way, you know, that Pantera, or a Roman soldier, was, you know, the father of Jesus Christ.
Right. And who knows where they got that information to begin with.
Yeah, it's interesting.
Right? It's another gap filler,
yeah, right.
as far as I'm concerned.
Well, I agree too. I mean, if you're a Christian, you believe in the miracle of Christ's divine birth, and that's the answer. You know, that an angel told Mary that Christ would be born. You know, divine incarnation, right?
Yeah, the Holy Spirit would overshadow her, and
that would be it.
Yeah.
So I'm sorry. Please
but let me just point out that even the Gospel of Thaddeus that states that, it does state that his birth came about as it did, quote, to fulfill what is written, behold, the virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and they shall call his name Emmanuel. So even in a text that states that his dad was a Roman soldier or some kind of soldier, it even tells you right there, it quotes Isaiah and it mirrors Matthew 1. So again, it can't get away from that fact. And then it's as if somewhere along the way somebody thought, hey, I know, I'll just claim that some soldiers are dead. But right there, it told you that the birth came about as it did to fulfill Isaiah's prophecy of a virgin birth.
Yep, there it is. Yeah, and they have like some strange parables that are in there that aren't in the Gospels.
Right.
And yeah, just some different things. And like, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek, which is
right.
That's an interesting. That's an odd one too. I mean, I think it sounds like Mormons. You know, they have an order of Melchizedek.
Well, okay, they do. I mean, that's actually mirroring the book of Hebrews,
right,
which is referring to the Psalms.
Right.
So that's accurate.
Yes.
The fact that somebody later on... Sorry.
I was just going to say that the order of Melchizedek, is that reference to a resurrected Christ in the Gospels? Because I don't remember that.
Okay, yes, it's in the book of Hebrews,
Okay, gotcha.
and it does affirm that Jesus is a priest after the order of
Okay,
Melchizedek.
so I forgot that. Gotcha.
Right. It's just the fact that later on in history, somebody like the Mormons, their own priesthood of Melchizedek, or another type of priesthood, that's a separate issue.
Gotcha.
Because the point of Hebrews is that Jesus is the one and only priest now in the order of Melchizedek, because every priest has to minister day after day and offer sacrifices time after time, but he did it once, and it's a done deal.
Gotcha.
So there cannot be an ongoing Melchizedek priesthood, period.
So that's it. So
because
he
Jesus
is the
fulfilled
Lord.
that.
Yeah. He filled that one singular
Right.
role. Gotcha.
Right.
Interesting. So, I mean, we've covered only about 3 or 4 or 5 of these apocryphal gospels in your book. You have 40. I didn't list it all, but there's tons of other. Acts of Thomas, Gospel of Bartholomew, Avenging of the Savior, all these ones that are written, all the way from 50 or 60 AD to 700 AD. But
Right.
do you want to kind of give your opinion of what your conclusion was about, you compiling and going through all of these different apocryphal texts?
Sure. So, it is popularly claimed. The basic presupposition is, look, whatever the Christians say is false. So therefore, whatever ended up in the Bible isn't true. And that leads to the conclusion that therefore every apocryphal text must be more correct than the Bible. Is that pretty much what you're getting from culture, William?
Well, it seems like it.
I mean, that's pretty much the bottom line, right?
Yeah. So,
and so no matter how odd, no matter how tortured, no matter how much it says, women don't deserve life, it doesn't matter. As long as it contradicts the Bible, our culture will prefer it over the Bible, right? And so the claim is, well, if you read these apocryphal texts, boy, you're going to get a completely different view of who Jesus was than you would in the Bible.
Right.
And I think that what I was trying to get at is, hey, I'll pick any apocryphal text you got and I'll read it. And what I found is inevitably I will find things in there that confirm what the Bible says. And then I might find some things that are what I call unique features. But so that what you end up with is a lot of affirmation down through the centuries of some basic facts about what the Bible says about Jesus, and then maybe certain non-biblical statements that don't contradict the Bible. They just happen to not be mentioned there, and they're either accurate or not. And then you have some statements that contradict the Bible, which show that these things are being made up, especially like we reviewed, if they're telling us that Jesus wasn't a physical being. I mean, that's just clearly, obviously not the case.
Right.
And so my point was to give examples of, I think my final total is 35 apocryphal texts. And
do you know the
just
total?
Review them and give you. Sorry.
Well, I was just going to say, do you know the total of apocryphal text? I mean, what the total possible amount of apocryphal Christian texts there are? I mean, it's something like, I don't even know.
That's something I've been thinking about lately, and I've not yet even figured out how to pose that question. You can say, well, how many apocryphal texts are there? But then if you start researching that, you need to realize that scholars will categorize these differently. So then you have to figure out how they're categorizing them, and then you'll have to look into those categories and see how many there are. So I don't know. It's pretty difficult. You'll have to look at sayings genre, apocalypse genre, gospel harmony genre, Gnostic genre. You're going to have to figure out what all the main categories are, and then try to figure out how many are in each category, and then try to count it from there. Right. All I know is I tried to be fair and picking a few from each genre
Gotcha.
and reviewing them. So I think that I got a good spread here going from 50 to 140 AD all the way to 700, 720
Gotcha.
AD. So that's a nice span of time.
But would you...
One genre we did... Yes.
Please continue.
I was just going to say, I just mentioned the apocalypse genre, which I didn't define earlier. Apocalypse genre, in a way, it's very much like Acts genre. It's post-resurrection. So again, the author doesn't have to really bother too much with historical facts, and so it would be very easy to make things up if that was the author's intention. And this deals with, sometimes they talk about what Jesus did between his resurrection and his ascension during the time when he was in what the Bible sometimes calls the heart of the earth, right, when Jesus went into what's known as paradise. And that's not heaven, by the way, paradise being a part of Abraham's bosom. So what did he do? And then you get all these fantastical tales about Jesus sort of battling it out with Satan in hell, and all these really crazy stories. In fact, if you think about the depiction that most people have of hell, they don't get it from the Bible. They get it from creepy medieval paintings and from apocalypse genre, because a lot of them is where you get all these really graphic descriptions of supposed tortures going on in alleged hell. You know, these really fantastical and nightmarish descriptions of that sort of thing. So that's a genre all of its own.
Gotcha. Would you consider that a general conclusion referencing these apocryphal texts is that it affirms the historicity of Jesus Christ?
Absolutely. One of the things that I mentioned in the conclusion of my book is that everybody wants a piece of Jesus, right? Everybody wants to claim Jesus for themselves. And so, for example, every religion will claim Jesus has some relevance to them, right? Maybe to the Hindus, he's an avatar. To the Buddhists, he's a bodhisattva, or the Maitreya Buddha. To the Taoist, he revealed the eternal Tao, right? To Islam, he was a prophet. So everybody wants to say, hey, Jesus is in our camp. And so he's such an undeniable personage that no matter what they make of him, they must make something of him because he is such an undeniable personage. And so when you read all these different texts and everything they have to say about him, one thing that they have in common is that they're dealing with the person of Jesus. Whether they want to say he wasn't physical, whether they want to say he was just a man, no matter what they say about him, they are forced to say something about him, right? Because he is a true reality.
Right. So, the historicity of Christ is established in these books, but you also see this desire to, like you said, turn the example and existence of Christ to people's preset notions or their own kind of Gnostic, possibly, or other traditional outview, like, oh yeah, he's one of us. So I think that happened. Right. I mean, the arc of the Gospels really is a revelation of the reality of Jesus as Christ, if you look at that. So even the people of that time and his followers were trying to, and finally Peter said, you are the Christ, right? But even after that, you see people, trying to shape the definition of Christ to their own kind of own liking.
Well, you remember. Well, if you remember, when Peter said, "You are the Christ," it is because Jesus asked them, "Who do people say that I am?"
Right. Good point.
And some say this, some say the other, and exactly that was going on while Jesus was alive on earth.
Right. And so then
And
it still
so I
it still
wanted to
kind of
point
comes
out,
full circle. 2,000 years to today, people are still saying, "Who's this person? Is he historically real? Did people make him up? Is he a figment of some political power?" You know, still kind of see that.
well, William, there is nothing new under the sun, is there?
No, it's not, really not. It's still the same questions. It's still happening today. Still same people deny. Still people accept the divinity of Christ, the reality of Christ, and some just are atheists. Maybe back then they didn't care, you know, or they had their own gods. You know, Zeus is my god, or you know, I take Moses as my example. You know, so
Right.
still the same today. So
I just want to, it is
please continue.
that, yeah, even counting the title page and the index page and the table of contents, this book is only 59 pages. So it's short, it's a fast read, and that was a basic reference where people could say, oh, wow, you know, people are claiming that if I read all of these apocryphal texts, Christians don't have a accurate. Well, you could go to this simple short book and learn a broken down and very basic, equipped to deal with this kind of issue.
Right. And where can people find your book?
Well, truefreethinker.com is my repository. You know, I view it as my library. If you go there, you'll be able to find everything quickly. And on the left menu, there's my list of social networking sites. And right up top, my little video commercial or ad that I made. So it'd be very easy to find it that way.
Great. And what else have you been working on recently other than this, a book about the apocryphal texts?
Well, I always have long-term projects and short-term research projects. So I'm always doing a lot. Right now, I'm actually working on publishing a book that'll be more like a magnum opus. So that's my big long-term research project.
Gotcha. What's the subject of that?
One thing I've been studying a lot, and okay, the subject of that one is that basically there is God, and then there's earth dwellers, right? Human beings and animals and insects and all that.
Right.
But there is this in-between realm where you have seraphim, you have angels, you have Satan, you have demons, you have evil spirits, wicked spirits, lying spirits. You have all these kinds of beings that the Bible mentions. And so the book is going to review absolutely every being that the Bible mentions that is not God and is not human. It's just in that in-between realm.
Interesting. I look forward
So
to
that's
taking
been
a
a
look at
very
that.
long-term research project.
Gotcha.
Yeah, that's been a long time coming. It's been a few years of research.
Is there anything else
I've been dealing with a tremendous... it's just because I was working on, and one of my shorter-term research projects has been writing a lot about the issue and giants and corresponding. It's been something I've been writing a lot about lately.
Oh, great. So is there anything else you'd like to cover before we wrap this up?
I think we're all set. We went through all your notes.
Cool.
We went through everything I had written down that I wanted to mention, and yeah, I think we hit everything.
Awesome. Hi, this is William Ramsey. That was Ken Ammi of TrueFreeThinker.com and the YouTube channel True Free Thinker. Thank you for listening.